And with that, Anna, we have our next guest with us, and the honor of the introduction is all yours.
Indeed it is. Listeners, we'll be speaking with Christopher C. Hull. He's currently the Executive Vice President for the Center for Security Policy. Dr. Hull is the immediate past Chief of Staff for a nationally prominent member of Congress. He's held politics and policy positions, including serving as Press Secretary in the U.S. House of Representatives, a Foreign Affairs and Trade Legislative Assistant in the U.S. Senate, and a researcher in a major think tank, and the Majority Staff Director of a state Senate. He's author of Grassroots Rules, How the Iowa Caucuses Help Elect American Presidents, and he's been published or quoted in television, print, radio, and online outlets, including New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Wall Street Journal. The list goes on. Dr. Hull, welcome to Conservative Commandos radio show.
Thanks so much, Anna. Glad to be on.
Oh, we're really glad you do the work that you do. And I love the title of this article you've written, Trump is Right, Gun-Free Zones Make Schools More Deadly. Love that title. We believe that here at Conservative Commandos Radio. Tell us why gun-free zones make schools more deadly, please.
Because they're disarming them.
Yeah.
This is as simple as that. What is happening is very straightforward. When the Bolsheviks took over the Soviet Union, the first thing they did was, by order of the Commissar, they began to collect people's guns. When the Nazis took power in Germany, one of the first things that they did was take people's guns. And the truth is that right now, you've got another force that wants to take power in the country. I believe it to be a hostile force, frankly. And that force is trying to do the same thing, collect guns. Well, what they want to do, is they want to start at the most sympathetic place they possibly can. Nobody could ever want to have guns in schools, right? Well, sorry, but where I come from, kids took guns to school all the time, and it was never a problem. In fact, it made the school safer because kids were raised to understand firearms and to be able to use them and handle them and clean them and use them safely. In either of my hometowns, it would be a deadly thing to walk into one of these schools and try to shoot the place up.
So you were saying, Doctor, I wanted to pick up on what you were saying with regard to children understanding how to use firearms and how it really did put kids, young people, in the position of knowing how to use those firearms. I wonder, did it also put them in a position where they could defend themselves if they were threatened? Was there perhaps a dampening effect on the idea of violence in the school because kids knew how to defend themselves? They weren't as vulnerable as they are today. Do you think that's true?
So we can prove that the absence of guns is associated with more deadly schools. And here's how. Part one, if you look at the number of shootings which took place in schools before and after the federal legislation banning guns in schools, you find that it is a stark difference. Before, the difference is that the number of shootings doubled and the number of kids killed, wounded and killed almost tripled. So on the numbers, it is clear that at least something else is going on and it ain't working banning guns in schools. But secondly, we can prove it because we have the journals of the shooters. The journals of the shooters show conclusively that they are aware that the schools are now gun-free zones. That is a fact. They discuss it at length, and then they go in and they shoot them up. And they are aware that no students and no faculty will be able to fire back, and they calculate that into their plans. Remember, these are intricately planned events. These kids are competing with each other like they're in a video game, trying to kill the most people. And they are aware that schools are gun-free zones. And frankly, it's one of the reasons that they're choosing to shoot up our schools in the first place.
Yeah, because there's no one there able to defend the children, not the children, not the teachers, not the security guard, not the administrative staff. No one is there. And by the time, when you have an active shooter situation in a gun-free zone, by the time the police arrive, it's over. So without a gun on the premises, I don't think you save the lives. It really requires some conversation. And I do think it's appropriate to talk about why the violence or the inclination toward violence exists. I mean, certainly we can talk about psychological issues that some of these shooters may have had. Could we have caught that with a gun registration or screening program or not? I mean, those are appropriate conversations. But this idea that any zone should be advertised as gun-free, it's almost inviting the violence. It just seems like a no-brainer to me.
It does. And by the way, this is not the way that federal legislators have reacted to other crises, right? We are hit by Pearl Harbor. We immediately, of course, announced that the entire United States is a gun-free. No, we didn't do that, actually. We built, thousands of tanks, and we invaded, and we destroyed the enemy. 9/11 happens, and immediately we announce that that every airport is a gun-free. No, we put people with assault weapons in every airport to make certain that anybody who tried to get through the screenings with a firearm or with an explosive or with the intent to do harm was destroyed. When there were a series of bombings, including, by the way, the bombing which took place, bombings and shootings which had to do with anarchists, which are in fact, Marxists, right? The reality is these are Marxists. Including one that took place inside of the Capitol building, we immediately announced the Capitol was a gun. No, what they did was they put in place more cops with guns at every entrance. And okay, do they have metal detectors? Absolutely, they do. Yes, but they've got 1, 2, 3. I've counted as many as 6 or 7 armed policemen at every entrance to these buildings of the members of Congress currently calling for disarming students and schools. Rank hypocrisy.
It is terrific hypocrisy. And the most vulnerable of our citizens are at risk with this inappropriate policy. I mean, the very vulnerable children that we're supposed to be protecting, we're leaving open to this violence with this policy. Look,
I couldn't agree. I couldn't agree more. And I want to tell you a personal story, actually. So, I'm sitting here in my car. I'm in Northwest Washington. It's lovely here, by the way. And I commute back and forth past the school where Malia and Sasha Obama used to go, right? I don't know whether they're there anymore or whether it's just because he's no longer president, but I'll tell you this. Every time I drove past that school during the time that he was president and they were there, you know what they had on every corner? Men with guns. Men with guns. There were black SUVs with guys, and, I doubt very much that it was just a Glock 9mm, that was sitting in there. I imagine that there was something more ready for anybody who tried to pierce that security perimeter with evil intent with respect to Barack Obama's children. But if it's your children, well, what we need to do is maintain these gun-free zones.
No, I'm not accepting that. I don't think we the people, the majority of we the people, are going to accept any of that. Dr. Hull, please hold on for just 1 minute. We have to identify the station, but we're not finished talking with you about this. I want to pick it up right after we have the break.
Thank you for staying with us, and you are listening to the Conservative Commandos radio show with Anna Little and yours truly, Rick Trader. And for rebroadcast of our show, please check out our websites, ccrshow.com or CCRS Network. And as a reminder, today's show is being brought to you by the First Amendment and protected by the Second. Anna, our guest is still with us. Please pick up the conversation.
I'm happy to do so. Listeners, we're speaking with Dr. Christopher Hull. He's the Executive Vice President of Center for Security Policy, and he's very experienced in foreign affairs. He's also had politics and policy positions in the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, also in a state Senate, and he's the author of Grassroots Rules, How the Iowa Caucuses Help Elect American Presidents. He's talking to us today about gun-free safe zones and how they actually make schools more deadly. Dr. Hull, thank you so much for waiting through that break. We do appreciate your time.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm enjoying it very much.
Well, we are very, very honored to have you. We're very proud of the work that you do. And I want to talk a little bit about statistics. We've been examining perhaps the inappropriateness of this gun-free school zone policy and how it actually creates a dangerous environment for the students instead of the opposite. But, some of these anti-gun folks, they want to tell us that when they impose this policy of gun-free school zones, that somehow it reduces homicides, that the school shootings are less, that there's less violence around the children. And I just don't think that's true. The statistics don't show that. Isn't that right?
That's right. So they're wrong, and you can prove it. Here's the deal. If you look at, we've discussed the fact that just on the basic numbers, if you look at the period before and the period after the Gun-Free School Zone Act was put in place, you find that school shootings, woundings, and killings all went up. So on that basis alone, you'd say it's a failure, but it goes deeper than that. I mean, of course, there are counter arguments, right? So your friends and mine on the radical gun-grabbing left will say, well, but what you're not taking into account is that murders have dropped substantially of young people over this period of time. And the answer to that is, well, that's absolutely true. So the number of actually the peak of the years when there was actually a peak of violence which took place, especially among young people in America, that peaked in about 93, 94, 95, right? And it came down for more than a decade after that. It just went down and down and down and down and down. Well, let's just notice something. The gun-free school zone Act went into effect in 1990, before that peak. And here's the problem with the argument. The murders were going down everywhere else. It's just that they were going up in the schools where the gun-free zones were, right? So it can't be explained by that. It also can't be explained by the homicide rate more generally. Is it true that the homicide rate came down based on the same thing, the end of the crack wave, because we put them in prison, right? We put the bad guys in prison. We stopped the radical left from releasing people onto the streets where they would kill people. And we put them in prison for longer periods of time. And lo and behold, people stopped killing people because they were behind bars, right? So that does drop over this period. But again, it doesn't correspond with what happens in schools. In schools, they go up. But here is the kicker. What proves the exception that proves the rule. The truth is that there's a spike in school shootings right after the Gun-Free Zone Act is put in place. And then it drops dramatically when the Supreme Court strikes down this bill as unconstitutional. And for a period till about 2000, when it was a very open question whether this bill was constitutional or not, there were very few school shootings. It was down. And then as it became clear that the Supreme Court was going to support taking away people's Second Amendment rights inside of schools, the school shootings began to increase, and they've been increasing geometrically ever since.
Well, it sure seems to me like the proof is in your facts and figures, and they seem as explained to be very rational, and yet the left-wing gun-free zone proponents will not hear those facts. They just will not hear those facts. I want to talk to you a little bit about the PROMISE program. Let's see, promotion of random offenses and misdemeanors by insane students escaping justice. Okay, I don't know. That just doesn't seem like listen, PROMISE program. It's paid schools to actually let the youth get away with criminal activity, basically.
Yes, absolutely.
What you're trying to do, I guess, in the minds of the administrators and the teachers who were pushing for this is not to put youth in jail, but to teach them constructively how to stay out of jail. And frankly, it doesn't work because the youthful offender just becomes an adult and continues to offend. And,
Absolutely.
That also affects these trends. I think, frankly, the best, I don't know, I'm a parent, so that's why I feel free to speak like this. Raised 3 children into adulthood. They're respectful, at least in front of their elders. and they're responsible, hardworking people, and they haven't come to mommy with their hand out looking to be taken care of, so I guess we did something right. But on this issue, if these children know that if they commit crimes or do something wrong, that there's going to be a consequence, and if they're taught that early, they don't step out of line as they get older. The same is true with these shooters. If they're taught that when they walk into a school, they're going to be shot dead before they can get a bullet off, they're not going to walk into the school with the gun, right? So it seems to me like the consequences are the way to manage the situation. And this idea that we're just going to legislate a solution to the problem. I mean, frankly, you have to meet violence with violence. I'm not saying an eye for an eye. I'm saying there's an appropriateness to it. But just as our government responds to an attack with a counterattack, you've got to do the same thing in the schools. And I think you agree with me, Dr. Hull. I think you were referencing that in some of our prior conversation. Go ahead and weigh in.
Yes, and let me broaden the lens a little bit, because this is the way that I see it as a recovering academic is this. In the 1960s, I'm sure that many of your listeners have watched One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? So in the 1960s. Your friends and mine at the American Civil Liberties Union and their allies. By the way, American Civil Liberties Union, which has been linked to radical left individuals and potentially to Soviet infiltration. It is conceivable that the ACLU was originally founded as an attempt to tear at the strings that hold the country together using our own legal defenses, right? So the ACLU and its pals went around all the insane asylums and got them shut down. They sued, they filed complaints, and they made it practically impossible to institutionalize individuals in the United States. And what happened? You had a massive crime surge as insane individuals were released onto the streets. And then we put them into prisons. And in fact, if you look at the numbers, it looks like basically what we did is we emptied the prisons of the violently insane, and then we put them into the prisons as they predictably committed crimes. Well, here's what happens today. Young people who are criminally insane we are unable to put them into facilities that would keep them safe and keep their peers safe. Instead, we are mainstreaming these children into our schools. It is like injecting toxins into the arterial blood flow of the country. And they did that on purpose, right? The left deliberately emptied our insane asylums. They emptied the places that we put people who were crazy, who wanted to kill people and were not rational. And then when these same people take guns and shoot up schools, they say, oh, let's take the guns away from the law-abiding people outside of the insane asylums. That's their rationale. And by the way, it'll never stop. They will never stop coming for our weapons, and our founding fathers knew that, which is why we have a Second Amendment. but we need to make the case for it, or else it will be taken away by a Supreme Court that just decides that the Second Amendment doesn't mean what it says.
Here on the Conservative Commandos radio show, we are speaking with Dr. Christopher Hall. He's the Executive Vice President for the Center for Security Policy. You know, Dr. Hall, I know we've been talking about gun-free zones in school, but it seems like, since I'm older than dirt, I can refer back to the Texas Tower shooting in the 1970s, which was, I guess, the start of these mass shootings, that it's not just the gun-free school zones that have become targets. It seems like just about every mass shooting, except for maybe two, since that time, have all taken place in gun-free zones. And, you know, when we talk about the police responding to a shooting, I think back to the Santa Barbara terrorist attack, that the police were only 1 mile away. They were actually conducting a drill at that time, and it still took them 5 minutes to get there. In the meantime, 14 people were dead, about 20 people injured. The shooters got away. There was no one there to protect those people against these shooters. The police weren't any help either. So your thoughts on those comments, and we'll wrap up the interview.
Yes, you know, you see the faces of these victims. You see the children. By the way, you only see the family members or the survivors who agree with the agenda of the left-leaning media, right? You very rarely see the other victims. You'll get a face and what have you, and then they'll move on. But I'll tell you this. I think that it makes me angry, right? It makes me angry. I get angry because I know what these arguments are. But here's the thing. We need to make clear to the public, to our friends, to our opponents, that they are the cold-hearted ones. Because the policies put in place by the radical left in this country cause death. They are causing these children to be massacred. The blood is on their hands. And
Doctor, I hate to interrupt, but we only have a minute or so left, but I got to ask you this question. Why are we conservatives losing this argument?
Well, you should have me back on, and I'll tell you.
I'd love to.
The arc of the left. But the bottom line is it's because they've taken over the instruments of communication in the country, just like they were instructed to by Marx 150 years ago. That's how.
Dr. Christopher Hall, we want to thank you so much for joining us here on the Conservative Commandos radio show. Please tell our audience how they could follow your work, read your articles, get your book, and also to follow the works of the Center for Security Policy.
Absolutely. You can follow me on Twitter at Christopher Hull. You can follow the center at Secure Freedom, because that's what we do. We secure your freedom. You can visit us at securefreedom.org. And I'd encourage everybody to sign up for our podcasts and sign up for our Facebook page as well.
Dr. Christopher Hall, thank you for joining us. Take care and God bless.